Hello everyone, and welcome back to Reverse Engineering Linux 32-bit Applications. In this video, we're going to wrap up our discussion of malware, and we're going to talk about obfuscation. So what is obfuscation? Obfuscation is trying to make it hard for other people to come in and reverse engineer your stuff, which is exactly the point of this course. So there are a couple of techniques that people can use in order to obfuscate their code. So let's talk about a couple of those. So I've gone ahead and loaded up my sandbox. I also have reconnected my networking. And I want to start by doing this. I want to do an app search for something called UPX. And I see UPX UCL. I'm going to go ahead and install that. Sudo apt install UPX UCL. And I'm going to install some new packages. Done. So, what is UPX? If I do it UPX -help, it will tell me a little bit more about this tool. It's the ultimate packer for executables. So this is one very simple way that people can try to obscure their code. They can use a packer. So what does a packer do? A packer will compress code. So maybe I have a very slow medium. Let's say it's a CD-ROM. Those are pretty slow. You know, if I'm really unfortunate, I have a floppy disk. Those are super slow. So I have a slow medium, and I want to get my executable off of that slow medium as quickly as possible. And what I'm doing is I'm trading RAM and processing time for disk space. So I will lessen my disk space. Another reason that you might use a packer is that I don't quite have enough space on a CD or a DVD to distribute my product. So I'm going to use a packer. So that is a reason I might legitimately use this. Sometimes people use it just for the sake of compressing it so you can't easily disassemble it. So UPX is a very, very common packer. And a lot of people will use this tool. Some people might modify it slightly in order to have their own packer, but we'll see that it's pretty easy to tell if something has been packed. We'll also show you how, if it's been packed with UPX, you can unpack it. So let's have a look at using this tool. I'm going to go ahead and pack my file, one of my bad executables. And if I look at how to use it, it says usage blah 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 -o file and then a file. So let me go ahead and do it. Say UPX -O, and I'll say Xingxi bind shell packed. And my input will be Xingxi bind shell. Now if I do an ls-l, I'll notice that my packed version has gotten a lot smaller. It's about half the size of my other version. So what if I look at it? What if I use, say, a hex editor to look at the start of this file? I don't have a hex editor installed here, so I'm going to use xxd instead on the start of this file. So you'll notice I have my standard elf header, but now I have some sections, UPX. And if I look into my file, what I'm going to find is a small program that's used to decompress the rest of it. So let me go ahead and quit. And let me have a look at this file. So I can look at this file by using a tool like rev or objdump. So what if I do an objdump -d on this? And it says, here's the file format. So I want to disassemble it. And notice it says I will display the assembler contents of executable sections, but it says, whoa, I'm not so sure that I saw those. So let's go ahead and look at the disassembly, and we'll say disassemble all, please. So we use a capital D. And now it still says, I don't know. What about readelf? I can say, please list my headers. I can use my elf file headers or my program headers. So I'll do a read elf on my program headers, or rather my file headers. We'll start there. Or Xingyi bind shell packed. So these are my file headers. And what about my sections? So now I have just a few sections. So it's not telling me as much as I normally would like. Now, how could I find out if something's been packed with a packer, especially UPX, since it's a very common packer? It's easy. grep UPX. Here's my executable, and it says binary file matches. So the chances of that matching in a normal situation is pretty low. So I'm already suspicious that this thing has been packed. You know, I don't have as many sections as I normally would if you think back to some of the other work that we've done in the past. So these all tell me that I should be very suspicious of my file. So what if it's been packed by UPX? Well, guess what? Download UPX and unpack it. Now, UPX will pack things not just for Linux, but many other platforms as well. It's the universal ultimate packing tool for executables. So you can also do this if you happen to be examining a Windows binary, which we're not talking about in this class at least. So just a little FYI on that one. Okay. So how can I unpack it? Well, let's look at our tool. UPX-help. We have commands, compress it faster. Oh, -D, decompress it. So let's try that. Let me run UPX-D on Xingyi bind shell packed. Now it's been uncompressed. If I do an ls-l, you'll notice that this is exactly the same size as that. Now if I rerun my commands, such as this one, I see a bunch of segments coming back. Again, that's a clue that it had been packed because I only had a couple of segments. And now that I decompressed it, they've come back. Here I see the same file headers. And I can try to disassemble it. I'm not going to do it on everything. I'm going to use the little d option. And boom, it's come back. So this is by far the most common way of obscuring code. Now, it used to be that I could obscure code by having self-modifying code. That's a little bit harder to do, especially on the Linux platform today, because of the memory region protections. You have memory regions that are not normally writable and executable. So that's pretty hard to do today. And things that are writable are normally not executable either. So, you typically don't have both. If you do, that's kind of a red flag that something's wrong, especially on Linux. So that's one thing you should be aware of. You won't see that very much. Now, the other thing is, if you did have that, you have to be pretty skilled at assembly in order to create such things, which fortunately not too many people are. And giving the operating system protections against stuff like that, it's also rather difficult. So the good news is You have to be skilled to do something like that. The bad news is you have to be skilled if somebody does do something like that. Some other things that you could do, simple things. You could try to use some obscure assembly instructions. We've only talked about some of the most basic assembly instructions in this course. There are some obscure ones out there that you could use. That's one thing you could do. Another thing you can do is you can try to use intermediate values a lot in your calculations, things that you don't really need to do. You could try to have some code inside your programs that isn't exactly the best. Now, one thing I will say, we have optimizing compilers today, and they're really, really good. So if, for example, I decide that I want to have a loop, and this loop has a constant value, I'm going to say 2 to this power, for example. Maybe it's 2 to the 16th power. What's going to happen is that the compiler will say, oh, he's going to use 2 to the 16th power. Let me do that math for you and put the result in and use that directly. So sometimes you might see people trying to obscure their code, but it doesn't always work the way they expect it. Optimized code is also very uniform. So that is something you can look for. If you see things that look a little different, it was probably handwritten. Another thing people can do is to inline functions. Now, we've seen several ways that you can analyze code in order to see all the functions that are being called. However, there is an optimization that can be done where every time you call a function, you don't really call a function. Instead, that function is just pasted inline in the code. And you might say, why would anybody do that? Well, they can do it to optimize their program. They're trading memory for execution speed because there is a penalty whenever you call a function. Or they could do it to obscure the code. Now you might say, what do you mean there's a penalty when I call a function? Well, there is. And here's why. Because you're going to have to switch context. You might be switching between user and kernel mode. You have to push things on a stack. You have to make a call. There's the call, there's the cleanup from the call, and all of that. So when I optimize my code by inlining those function calls, it makes it harder to follow. By the way, this is something that's pretty common if you are using microcontrollers. Microcontrollers have limited memory, so making a bunch of function calls is extra expensive for them. They might have a limited stack. It's not like what we have here in the world of Linux, where the stack is essentially unlimited. So there are places where you might have inline calls. Normally, if you inline a function, it should be short. However, nobody says they have to be short for you to inline them. You can inline all of the functions if you choose. So that is another method that can be used to obfuscate your code and make it a little bit harder for you to figure out what's going on. All right. Well, that pretty much wraps up what I had to say about reverse engineering malware. And as a reminder, this course is one in a series of videos and courses that we have here at Pentester Academy, your source for all things InfoSec. And I look forward to seeing you in this course or another course soon. See you then.